So I'm going to be interviewing Barbara in this intimate setting with just a few close friends who seem to have popped by spontaneously. And before I start that, I do want to say we're really pleased that working with Barbara on this is about the Duke ESG work, and so this is front and foremost for them as well, and much appreciated that they've hosted it. Why this book and why now?
No, and I think it's an important question, isn't it? Why this book and why now? And there's a lot that's been written already about leadership in general. You can find all sorts of books around leadership. There's lots that's been written around race and often problems around race. But there was nothing that brought together leadership and race in a way that talks about black leaders in a positive way and in a way that kind of gives you an insight into their real day-by-day lives. So bringing those two things together and really helping readers to understand how black leaders navigate in a very positive, unapologetic way. That was really important for this book. I'm also a mother of 3 daughters, 2 of whom are now in the workplace. And I noticed as they entered into the workplace, they were having some challenging conversations, they were having some difficult experiences, and they didn't have any kind of vocabulary that they could call on, and they also didn't have anything that they could show to their leaders, their managers in their new worlds that said, have a look at this might help you to understand me a little bit better. So that was also a reason, I think the reason that I'd got the children. And I think perhaps the third reason is because I've come at this, and got a lot of my colleagues here, I've come at this as somebody who's worked in leadership and in change, and then branched over into inclusive leadership, and I couldn't find anything. If I was to recommend somebody something to say, well, where is the academic work, even something that's quasi-academic, that covers black leaders in Britain, there was nothing. So there was quite a gap in the market.
So there's a particular follow-up in terms of the particular focus of the book. As I was just preparing for this conversation this morning, and I wrote down you had a very crisp sentence about who this book was for. And let me check that I've got it right, because I'd like you to say a bit more about this and why you think this needs to be the audience for this. It said, it's for white leaders who don't know where to start, what to say, or what to do.
Yes. Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because, when I wrote it with a white audience in mind. And I wrote it because I spend most of my days with often white, middle-aged senior leaders, a bit like yourself, John, often, often Oxbridge like yourself as well. And for me, those were the people that really had very little, if any, insight into the kind of experiences of black leaders. So they were really the main audience as I was thinking of writing the book. I was almost writing to them. And there was something for me that said, and I got some of this even from my children's experiences going new into the workplace. They said they don't know where to start. Because they don't understand my life, they don't understand my experiences, they can't start to have a conversation with me. So the idea is that you've read the book, you're now in a position to start to have a conversation, even if it is only to share that book with your black colleague and have a conversation around the book.
Thank you. Since you've named one of the particular elephants in front of people in this room, which is, how do you feel about being interviewed by me, as you've named? I am pretty much the white British establishment personified. I mean, how does that feel? What are the sort of dynamics that get evoked in you?
There are lots of dynamics, some of them, and a tension between some of them, because on the one hand, as I've said, you're the audience. In many ways, you represent the challenge and the solution to this, because you're the challenge in the sense that you're the people that we want to engage in this kind of material and in this kind of conversation. And you also have the solution. If we go, as I've mentioned, the organisations are full of people like you. So in that sense, it feels like you're my audience, and yet it also feels like I'm kind of peeling away bits of myself and almost kind of exposing bits of myself to you that I wouldn't want to expose to a white leader. I mean, it's slightly different with you because I know you've read the book. Yes, I know, I do know you've read the book, but ordinarily it would be for me actually, and I mean it quite seriously, it would be for me a very uncomfortable conversation. Why would I want to talk to you about my race? Why would I want to talk to you about my experiences? Why would I think for a moment that you might get it? So for all of those reasons, yeah, it's difficult to have these conversations because there's also, there's the anxiety that, and I speak personally, that builds up that says, well, if I say something and you don't agree with it, you will resist it or you'll push back rather than lean into a conversation. So I'm glad that it's with you because I think there's also something, and I think, we've kind of talked about this a little bit, there's also something about engaging people and allowing them to make mistakes in that process as well. This doesn't have to be a perfect conversation. If you talk to someone who is white, and I'm talking about black and white, I said it in the book in essentialist terms, not in any kind of that, because it makes it easier that way. So yeah, have I answered your question?
You have. When you used the phrase peeling back, I had just goosebumps. I felt really uncomfortable when you said that because it was this sense of, and I could see it almost, oh, you as an object, something of study. Oh, how interesting, Barbara. To see your, this, you've gone through quite a lot of difficulties, haven't you? You've had quite a lot of hurdles to jump over. I say that must have been jolly tricky. What was it that I was acutely aware of when I turned that question on myself? And I was thinking of, actually, I had to do a whole load of work. Very briefly, and you talk about in the book, I can visit this problem or this challenge, but most of the time I don't have to. When I am talking with you most of the time, I have to be acutely conscious. I have to be reflecting on myself. I have to be paying attention to my assumptions. I have to be paying attention, in my case, to some rather nasty racist little tropes that I was brought up with. And it's all that is present. And it is that, actually, I think for a lot of white, I'll use the word advantage rather than privilege, people, that sense of, actually there is work that I have to do. And that is often the case of, rather than it being the black person who has to do the work, we have to do the work together. And I just love the bit in the book where you say, part of your object is you want to avoid problematizing black people and vilifying white people. I just thought, oh, lovely. Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. Now, another question for you. So back actually to the book, since we are promoting a very good book called The Model Black, just in case people were unclear about what this was about. Why the title, and how has your thinking changed over the life of writing it?
Right. So what I want is that the model black to be a new paradigm, almost a kind of a new trope in black leadership. And it's what I mean by that is this is about the black person that says, this is the environment I'm in. How am I going to succeed in that environment? It might require me to adapt. It might require me to silence. I mean, I talk about squaring, becoming more like the white population. I talk about self-silencing. I talk about softening the way I behave, or the way we behave as black people. So the model black is this person, but this person who does it not in a kind of, oh, I'm a dreadful victim. It's a person that says, I need to succeed in this environment. I can't control a lot of this environment. I can't control a lot of the way people around me think. I can't control a lot of society. So given that I have no control over those things, here is what I'm going to do to succeed. And the model black gets their head down, gets on with it, and mostly they're positive. These are positive, forward-looking people. So that's where, the title actually came rather late in the thinking, because when I started to do the research, I didn't know what I was going to come up with. I didn't know I'd end up with all these people saying, I just get my head down and get on with it, Barbara. I don't complain. I just push on through regardless. So that's kind of what the model black is. And in many ways, I look around now and I think, oh, that's a model black person. Oh, they're behaving like the model black. So I'm kind of using it in that way. So I guess that's why the title. In terms of how my thinking's changed, maybe I've kind of answered that, because I think as I spoke to people, lots of things surprised me. I was surprised how much similarity there was between all these black leaders. And what was also interesting for me was I interviewed people who are not in the book because actually they were not the model black. And a lot of the non-model blacks, I mean, there's almost another book to come, because actually, when I talked about navigating, a lot of the people who had spoken up and complained were no longer there. I spoke to individuals who'd had 3 big settlements from city companies. I spoke to individuals who decided they could no longer work in that kind of environment. I mean, there's data, I think, you know, in The Guardian this summer, there's data around the number of black people that just leave the organisations. The ones that I spoke to, the ones that kind of got their head down, plodded on and said, somehow I'm going to make this work.
I'm going off piste here because I was talking to someone just before we started this interview, and we were talking about the whole notion of tempered radicalism, which is that, you know, how do you live on the edge of being the voice of difference, but not so different that you're spat out? How do you? I mean, you've found a way of making this work. I mean, how have you walked the line between being that voice of difference and being accepted?
That's a very good question. How have I walked that line? Do I walk that line? I mean, it's very interesting because this book, I'm going to kind of relate it back to the book. The book has been in gestation for about 20 years. It started when I wrote my one of the degrees I did. I did something on objectivity in performance management, and I thought to myself, there are stories here that I want to talk about, but I didn't think I could write this till I was at the end of my career. I thought, you know, if I come out and I write about this, who's going to promote me? Who's going to want me in their organisation? There's always that fear that surrounds speaking out. So I'm not sure I have walked the line. I've been the one who's self-silenced. I've not spoken up. I've been the one who's smiled when people make those unpleasant comments. I've been the one who's softened, who's not dared to be angry. So I'm not sure I've walked the line. I've got to a place in my life where I think, actually, if I never get paid work again, I'm not saying that with you, but yeah, you know, I do still have bills to pay. But I think I have got to a point where I think, actually, I do not now need to behave in a way to earn the money. Yeah, I'm able to share this, and strangely enough, I'm surprised somebody else didn't write it. I kept thinking someone's going to write this book. Someone's going to talk about what it's really like for black people. So I'm not sure I've walked that line. I'm not sure how possible it is to walk that line. And you know, my brother's here in the room. In the last chapter of the book, we have that conversation about the kind of militant black versus the model black. And I don't know where the line is in the middle. And I suspect that part of the challenge we have, and hopefully the book will help us, is to find that space in the middle. You don't have to be militant. You don't have to be model. Where is that space that we can talk about difference, hear it in a really positive, engaging way, and not be labelled in some kind of negative way?
That was terrific, thank you. I'm going to do a bit of a crunching gear change now onto, well, maybe it's not such a crunching gear change, because you know, a lot of corporates and a lot of the public domain, you know, the world is filled with diversity and inclusion initiatives. And I know within the book you identify that they sort of achieve some things, but on their own, probably not that much. How would you like to see your work make more of be more than a diversity and inclusion impact?
I think one of the things that's, you know, I mean, I'll reiterate that I've come to this from the perspective of leadership and change. So that's kind of the lens that I've come to this with. And I guess what we see in that world and what we often see in the D&I world is a lot of initiatives. Yes, so I've sent them on that leadership course, I've ticked that box, we've brought in a few consultants, we've ticked that box. And actually, this is work that requires a real kind of organisational change. This is about culture change. This is about different ways of seeing people who are different. This is about interacting with people who are different in different ways. But from a broader organisational perspective, this isn't an initiative. This is a way of thinking differently. This is a way of sometimes, I think I call it being different. Yeah. Because, this requires people to do deep work on themselves in the same way that we, as we go into organisations and we want them to do deep work on themselves as leaders. So why don't we expect them to do this kind of deep work? So there's the deep leadership work, and there's the fact that this isn't about an initiative. This is about culture change. This is big organisational, almost structural work that needs to happen.
You talked about culture change. And you wouldn't think that you could be interviewed with me without me bringing in the P word.
That's the P.
How does power and powerlessness play out for you?
That's a bit deep. That's a bit heavy, John.
You wouldn't think of it.
You know what's interesting? In many ways, writing the book has empowered me. There's something really powerful about being able to bring the stories out there. So that. And there is also there was something for me very empowering about the people that I spoke to. They wanted, a lot of them didn't want to be named, but they wanted their stories told. So there is something for me that gives me power about doing this. There is something quite interesting. I mean, it's interesting you use the words power and powerlessness. There's something quite interesting in all this work that I've done, in doing the research for this book, that I'm trying to think of how to say this in a good way, in that I mentioned one of the key things in writing the book is about black people. We're not victims. We happen to be in this society. We happen to be faced by all these tropes. We happen to face all these structural challenges, and we get through it. What I find challenging is when we are put in this position of having to please the other, of being put in a position of powerlessness. So that I find difficult. I'm not sure how well I'm explaining that. And maybe there's just something else that just occurs to me as you talk about power and powerlessness. Whilst I've tried very hard to make this book about very unapologetic, there's a realism to it, isn't there? There's a realism that says we can't speak out. There's a whole chapter in there, isn't there, on self-silencing. So there's a realism. So let's not pretend we are in charge and we've got power. Actually, we can't get up tomorrow and say, actually, you made all those racist comments yesterday, and actually, I'd like to take you to one side, or, may I give you some feedback? So in many ways, there's a kind of tension that it's great to get this out there, but fundamentally, a lot of black people in the workplace find themselves in a position where they're navigating power in a way that white people don't have to.
That's beautifully put. Thank you. Right, can you have a bit of a breather now for a second? So, have people got a question that they would like for Barbara to riff about? Did your research give you any hints and tips about how you engage with people with invisible disabilities than visible things that mark them to be marginalised in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest that the work was around race and it was around black leaders. So in many ways, everybody I spoke to, the difference was visible. So in that respect, that wasn't a core part of the research. However, when I've shared the book with people, a lot of people who are not part of, what can I call it, the kind of, well, let's call it the white middle class, middle-aged group, they've said they found it really helpful because it helps them to articulate how it feels not to be part of that group, to be on the outside. So, one of the people who read it was a gay man, and he thought that was really helpful to him. I've had other people who've said there's something, a lot of the language and the ways of, just the ways of talking about it resonate really well with other people who are not part of this you called it the in-group. So I think that's probably as good an answer I can give to that.
You identified militant black and model black. How do you see the differences and how do you reconcile?
I mean, that is, in many ways, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, I can answer the first bit in terms of how I see the differences. I mean, a lot of it is discussed in the last chapter of the book when there is this conversation between myself and somebody who I regard as a militant black. So the model black is, as I've explained, it's the person who does, I'm going to be much more like the people around me. You know, I'm not going to speak up. I'm going to not get angry. So that is very much the model black, and who deals with it in a way that is well received by, and this is my words, white people. Yeah, we kind of know how to do it in a way that they won't be offended because we've worked our way into that well enough. Yeah, or we're scanning so much all the time that we know what's needed from me in this moment. Yep, so that's the model black. The militant black is the black that, I'm not having this. Yeah, and this is probably the person that calls attention to the structural problems in society, calls attention to the structural problems in the organisation. So you know, had I been a militant black in one of my organisations, I'd have said, isn't it interesting, we haven't got any black people here. Isn't it interesting that only certain people get put forward for certain pieces of work? Isn't it interesting that we actually don't have a vocabulary here that we can talk about difference? I would never have done that because I wanted work. And the militant black even goes a step further. So the militant black might be the one they don't last in traditional workplaces, right? Yeah, I mean, and I don't know, I'd be curious to hear from you guys here. I haven't come across a militant black in a traditional hierarchical workplace. But, you know, so it is the person that is much more, and perhaps the person that foregrounds their race in a way that draws attention to a lot of the ongoing inequalities. That, I would say, is how I would talk about the militant black. How do you reconcile them? I think there is something about having, I keep talking about conversations, but I think there is something about having the space to have this kind of discussion. What is the model black? What is the militant black? Where do we find the space in our organisations to hear the voices of both of those people? Maybe it's a conversation to have in a workplace. How can we reconcile it? And even, why is it we don't have any militant blacks here? Where are they? What is it about us as a culture that doesn't allow that kind of person to speak out, to have a voice in our organisation?
So given the generational shift with the Gen Z black young people coming in who are not going to adopt the model, they're going to be more militant. How do you feel, how can you see the world adapting to what might turn into a generational division?
Yeah, I think, and I like the question, and you know, in the last chapter of the book, I've interviewed a number of people from that generation, partly because part of the conversation I had was, is it the same for young people? And I've mentioned I've got, you know, children in that middle end 20s age group. And what I found is there is a generational divide and there isn't. So what I've said, and I say it in the book, the new generation will name it. Do they make progress with it? I don't know. Right? So they will name it, they will say this is what's happening, they're much more aware of it, and I think you're right, they would probably speak up earlier than some of the other, than perhaps people of my generation. However, they are still faced with the same people that they are having to have those conversations with. What I have seen, and I've seen it in professional services as well, is there is much more, I think, as well, of a willingness in some organisations to engage in those kind of conversations. So there is a willingness to say, well, let's try and understand. I mean, there's a lovely example I put in the book of, and that's a professional services company. I need to be very careful with pseudonyms. And that is where, this is a young person, professional services, mid-20s, and the senior partner takes out a number of young black males who have just come into the company, and he takes them out to a restaurant in Tottenham. And this guy is Eton educated, and he does it because he says, I want to understand your world. Now that may not have happened half a generation ago. The question for me still, and I think it is still a question for the new generation, them speaking up, having people understand your world, then what? Yeah, when we see the difference, when we see those numbers in organisations, so if I look 10, 15 years from now and I say, that generation really made a difference, look at the middle management, it looks completely different. Or, you know, take whether it's the National Health Service, whether it's the Met, these organisations where there's a lot written about, then I will believe it. But I think a lot of the things are still relevant. Because there is something, and for the young men I spoke to, I can't tell you how many, but for that last chapter, I spoke to a number of young black men. And what I noticed were, and this is talking as a mother with 3 girls, I thought, my goodness, they're wonderful husband material. and I kept thinking, why am I thinking they're such good husband material? And I think it's because they've got this thing that I call in the book sensitivity quotient. So maybe there is also something about the kind of black men that those organisations are bringing in, the kind of young black men, they're already soft. They're not militant. So they're already weeding them out at a very early stage. So I'm not sure. So I think there is a difference and we need to be alert.
Is there another type of black identity, the fluid black, who operates much more strategically, choosing which fights to have?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's almost a spectrum, isn't there? In many ways, the book is a starting point for a discussion around the spectrum of ways that people show up, ways that black people probably show up. So I think in that way, it's a starting point for a discussion. There almost certainly is. And, you know, a lot of the people I spoke to who I would consider to be the model black, they did what you did. However, a lot of them did it quite late in their careers. Yeah, so a lot of them did it at the point where they think, I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm not quite untouchable, but I'm at a stage now where I'm established. Yeah, people can't really touch me anymore. So, and that's the point at which they talk about it. What was really interesting is, as I said, I wanted white people to read the book. That's who the book was for. And when I gave it to black people, a couple of them, one, I won't name her, said, I'm in tears. Because you've given me the language to express my experience. The jolt. Yeah, I was jolted today. Yeah, you've given me that, you know, exactly what you said, that self-silencing, all of that language that helps them to understand themselves, because a lot of the black people had actually not, you know, I won't keep going on, but when I did the interviews for the book, one of the really refreshing things for me was a lot of the black people were talking to me about things they'd never talked to anybody about. They were suddenly coming up with stuff and they said, I've never talked to anybody about this, Barbara. Yeah, so I thought that, you know, there's something, and then, as I said, the black people I gave to read the book said, now I've got the language, I can talk about it, and it helps me in a way with some of the trauma that I've got, because there's stuff that went on years ago. I self-silenced, that's what it was. So yeah, thank you, thanks for raising that.
Final question is, what do you want to happen after people read The Model Black?
Yeah, and I think, you know, in a way we've already started to say some of that, haven't we? So we've started to talk about people having an informed, intelligent conversation, because I think often, yes, so that's one of the things I would want to happen, because if I'm now talking to you, John, you've read the book, we have a very different conversation. Yeah. Than if you hadn't read the book. So I think there's something about people being able to have informed, intelligent conversations. And I think there is something about people saying, well, what are we going to do about this? This is what's going on. Are we prepared to live in a society where parts of the population, whether it's visible difference, as in I've talked about, or invisible difference, are somehow excluded, or do not feel that they can bring, you know, that phrase, bring their whole selves to work, but bring as much of themselves to work as they want to. So I think it opens up a one-to-one conversation, but hopefully a broader conversation about inclusion more broadly and what we're going to do about it. You know, in the workplace, and ideally, I mean, you know, we almost need a social movement. You know, we're talking about in the workplace, you almost feel you want to take it to that next level and bring it to a social movement, but, you know, one step at a time.
Barbara, you were utterly brilliant. Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you.